Today, we're joined by Katie Burkhart, the mastermind behind Matter Logic. Our conversation covers how social impact organizations can make strategic planning more effective, actionable, and human. We discuss what key questions a strategic plan should be able to answer for your internal team, the difference between strategic planning and a brand or marketing strategy, and some of the struggles of outdated approaches to organizational strategy in general. I really enjoyed this conversation with Katie. I personally learned a lot, and I hope you find it valuable if you're in the social impact space and working towards making strategic work more effective to drive social change for your mission. So Katie, thanks so much for joining us today. We got connected through a mutual colleague and started talking all things strategy, design, the kind of weird Venn diagram between our two disciplines. And we're really excited to just have a conversation. So we'll dive right in. The first thing I'd love to get your take on is, how do you define strategic planning in your work with your clients?
So we actually, when we sit and work with clients, while they may be coming to us saying, hey, we need help with our strategic planning process, we don't actually use that phrase anywhere in the way that we talk about our work, and usually have to, part of what our process is with clients is to help them rethink and sort of undo some of that and approach strategy differently. The way we understand strategy is that you have a core as a business and you need to make choices based on that core. That's what strategy is making those choices. And not just making them every 5 years at a grandiose level, but making choices every single day about what you do as a business and how you go about doing it. And that's how we really get you to become truly strategic across the board. So really thinking through that is always step one. As far as what happens to the plan part, like how do we know what we're doing? We always like to spend time, and we can dive more into this because of its very deep overlap with brand, looking at the business's design. But when you think about what is traditionally included in a strategic planning process, what people are looking for is, well, where are my goals and where are my budget and how do I know what the plan is? You can call it a variety of different things. We typically use the term roadmap, and you can make that roadmap over whatever time horizons you would like, and what works for you and your organization and the pace of your organization. But that's where you can put in those, hey, here's where we are now, here's what we want to achieve, and then these are the steps that we're going to take to go about hitting those targets or meeting those milestones. So that part is fantastic. Some processes include both at the same time, some do them separately. For us, we always start with a strategy, and we start with it alone to make sure that we really understand that we're clear on the value that the business exists to deliver and how specifically the business is going to go about delivering that value. So that always is done first. We do our work and would always recommend that in that process, you're doing it with your stakeholders actively engaged. It is somewhat fascinating to me that today, how many both businesses and nonprofits engage in these sorts of processes in closed door, C-suite only conversations, only to find out that, what they thought does not actually match up with reality. If you exist to serve this particular population or this particular group of people, why not engage them and actually find out what they need from you, what's working, what's not, what outcomes you really need to help them to get to in order for you to really fulfill your purpose. So we always do that and have those working groups engaged throughout our process. So that's that. If I had to pick one thing that a process should include, that would be number one. Number two would be do the strategy first to make sure you're clear on that strategy so that when you sit down to actually build a plan, a roadmap, set goals, whatever that looks like for you, you can use that core as a filter to say, should we even be doing this in the first place? Is this the best way to go about doing what it is that we want to do? And asking those type of tougher questions and be able to filter out what does not strategically fit for your business.
I resonate with so much of that. I want to rewind to something you said earlier in the conversation around strategic planning is not something that should just be done every 3 to 5 years behind closed doors, but strategy is something that you're doing every day. And I think it's interesting from our perspective, serving the social impact sector, we work with a lot of nonprofits. Strategic planning, even that term especially, is very common in the space. And it is often done in this kind of grandiose once every 3 years, sometimes even 10 years. I'm glad to see that trend going away. And it's an interesting thing from our perspective because when people come to us, they say, hey, we just did a strategic planning process, or we're about to embark on a new 3-year strategic plan, or whatever it is. And when I hear that, I say, I have no idea what that's going to look like when you give it to me, because what we get from people from these various planning processes, whether they're done completely internally or without external consultants, the output of that and the insights from that process can be so different from client to client. Sometimes they can be actually quite helpful, and sometimes they're not helpful at all. And we really have to kind of reverse engineer. And when we ask questions that in theory a strategic planning process should lead to for the clients that we're working with, they can't answer some of these simple questions. So I really like this reframing around strategy and plan. They're not separate. They need to be done together. And also that strategy is something that you're doing every day, kind of leading back to what you called, I think, the core of the business, and supporting that in your everyday actions.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the things that would be interesting for me to understand is what you're doing is something that we practice in our work, is that, and this is a longer conversation I'll skip over, but we in some cases have gotten much more excited about the document, less excited about the action that we actually need to take, right? Like, we've created our strategy, here it is in this document, versus being like, actually, it's the verb, it's the activity that you're doing, it is the making of the choices, it is the enacting on those choices and understanding whether they were effective. That is really what strategy is all about. So getting people more comfortable with that. A big piece of that is asking the right questions and being able to answer them, right? Like, we don't always need to make it so damn complicated. I don't know if you've gotten those like 500-page dense PDFs that like some very large consulting firm put together. Like, it may be genius, but like ain't nobody gonna read it. And in most cases, the organization didn't really participate in the development of that. So it's not theirs. They don't understand it because they did not produce it. So that creates all sorts of additional barriers. But from your point of view, what questions would you want to come out of a strategy or strategic process, or even a strategic planning process, for you to be more effective in what you're doing? Because you're on to something that it's like, hey, we're asking questions. We want the answers. We don't necessarily care what format you put your document in, but you need to have answers to these questions.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the way I think about it at a big picture is, when clients come to us, they're looking for some kind of transformational change. And so we need to understand a couple of things at a high level to be able to do that. The first part is we need to understand, like, where are we starting from? What's the snapshot look like today? To a degree, how did you get to where we are today as an organization? What have been some of the past challenges and opportunities? How have you overcome them? How have you used those opportunities to your advantage to, create a way of doing things with a point of view as an organization? And then most importantly, where are you trying to go in the next year or 2 years or 3 years, or whatever the right timetable is to look at? So we need to understand very clearly what the desired future state is. And sometimes that's the part that seems very missing from a strategic plan in a very strange way. Or if there is that kind of desired future state, it'll be outlined, but there's no kind of pathway to get there. I think about it like, okay, we're at the bottom of the mountain, we want to get to the peak, and somehow we're going to get up there. And so I think some of the questions we often ask relate to things like fundraising, capacity building, how we express the impact story. That's where we can really come in to help. But even questions sometimes like, okay, so here's your goal, here's where you're trying to go. What does that look like in terms of revenue generation? Like, you're a $2 million a year nonprofit and you need to be a $10 million a year to hit that vision. How are you planning to create that extra capacity for fundraising? What are some of the strategies? Often our work leads to some of that, but we have to understand the bigger kind of goal and vision and scaffolding from an organization to be able to advise on how creative work and digital work can support that. And I think there is this kind of healthy tension between brand strategy, marketing strategy, digital strategy, messaging, some of the things that we do, and a broader organizational strategic plan, or in the business world would just be called a business plan, right? Or a marketing plan. So I think that's where there should be a little bit of back and forth between our work and strategic planning, or an organization just having a clear strategy.
Yeah, there's two threads that you picked up on there that's really interesting to me. The first one is, when people say, well, what is strategy? Usually the answer is, well, it's not the plan. The strategy and the plan are two different things. And unfortunately, what that's done is it's created a false wall between strategy and execution, as if they were different. They're not, right? You make choices, whether you make them at the biggest level or you make them in how you're interacting with a customer in the storefront that day, like whatever that might be, how you're, if you're a nonprofit, how are you communicating with people? How do you answer their question when they come to you? How do you reach out to donors? Like, all of that ends up being strategy. So that accidental, we did it to try to help people understand that making lots of goals, like, you can make goals with no strategy, and to try to deal with that. But I think because that's become such a mantra, we've accidentally made it so that what ends up happening is there's these really cool, highly aspirational strategic priorities that sound really cool. And then there's like all the other stuff we do, versus really looking at all of this stuff is what we really need to understand and make sense of, and should be folded into how we're moving forward. Revenue, which is one that you zeroed in on, is the other thread that I find really interesting in how we do this. Businesses will love to sit and spend hours making really cool revenue projections. The reality is you don't actually control whether somebody buys your service or whether someone makes a donation. Like, you are not in control of them. You cannot make them do it. But you can think through what your actions are and how you're designing that business to be effective in the first place. And I think nonprofits, I don't know how often you see this, but I see this, are in so need of money, right? Like, they need money like anyone else. There's not as much thought put into how are you really designing that? Like, that is part of the design of your business and should be strategic in nature. So most people think that the difference, for example, between a for-profit and a nonprofit is that a for-profit is there to make money and nonprofits somehow don't need money, which is all sorts of wrong, up one side and down the other. The difference, in our view, is the gap between the revenue source and the person served. If you're a business, right, the person you serve is your customer. They are also the source of your revenue. It's one of the most focused business models you can have. A true charity, there is usually a huge gap in between the person who can fund your efforts and the person who's benefiting from them, the person that's receiving the value. But sitting down and really understanding that strategically, really thinking deliberately about, we really want to help this person or this group of people, how are we going to get money to make this happen, really should be part of that process, and is going to be huge. I had a third thought. I'm so sorry. I said two. Here's three. Is going to be huge for all of your work, because brand is building that experience, the entire experience, as not just messaging, but how you get the message, where you get the message, how you interact with the message, the whole digital experience, because so much of it is digital, although there's room for in-person, as far as how do you actually get out to these people, communicate the value, communicate how they get engaged and why they should get engaged, to actually try to make that happen. So not having that conversation, not really looking at that as part of the strategy, just sort of seeing that as, business as usual, I think is such a mistake. And I think really guts some of your ability to go out and be incredibly deliberate in what you're recommending.
Yeah, I completely resonate with that as well. And I think that's why we spend so much time trying to understand the trajectory and the strategy as it relates to fundraising, because as we've talked about, especially nonprofits, but even some like social enterprises who are more kind of like almost like startups often, especially in the early days, they're usually under-resourced. And so they might be bootstrapping, or they may be around for 30 years and still under-resourced because the sector is under-resourced in general, which is a shame and something that a lot of people are really working hard to fix, which is great. But I think there's this sometimes there's a lack of focus and clarity of a point of view and a strategy for an organization that's under-resourced, because having the time and the space and the capacity to have these bigger picture thoughts day to day is really hard when you're stuck in kind of a starvation cycle or reactionary thinking, or really just trying to get through the next week of work. You have to have time to kind of put your head above water. And I think that is why often you see these kind of retreat style or like once every 3 year sessions, is because it's just hard to plan for that weekly or daily. I've noticed with strategy is that the simpler a strategy is, the more easily any given team member can articulate that strategy with understanding, the more likely it is that strategy will actually come to fruition. Yes. So you get these 500-page documents, no one reads them, to your point, no one understands them, to your point. So how can you expect anyone to actually act on them in their given role and contribution within the organization?
You know, it's sort of amazing when we see that. And one of the things, which is very much based on old assumptions about work, and I'm working on a larger conversation on this, or article and thought process on this, so I apologize if it's a little scattered. But this whole concept of goal setting, and in some cases the planning piece of this itself, is meant to be like, well, you know, we don't really want people to have to think that hard. Like, we want to make sure that they totally understand and we can kind of mechanically put the pieces together, which admittedly, like, there's research that suggests that this simply doesn't work. You know, so to your point about simplicity, and there's such a brand connection, or more specifically a narrative connection, which I think is, and I humbly throw out there, desperately missing from the majority of what we see. And we as an agency are working to increase this with our own clients, is the narrative. Help me to understand simply what's happening. One of the best ways to do that is through story. And there's such an opportunity internally to sit and be able to say, if these are the key choices that we're making as a business, right? We know our core, and these are the key choices, or the key focus areas, or the key levers, whatever phrase suits your fancy, that we're really focused on as a business right now. And these are the targets that we've set out to hit over the next year. I'm looking for a narrative, something that helps me understand, here's how those pieces connect together. No amount of cool cascading software replaces a human story that helps me understand how it goes together, and preferably doing it with as few words as possible. We have really not, and I don't put random word counts on things because that's not helpful, but we really work with clients to say, do you need to call it funky terms, or could you simply put it in a question and give them a good answer, which I think can be a lot more accessible as well. I'm also curious as to, you know, what your thoughts are about the power of narrative and brand and storytelling and digital looking internally, because that's what you're asking about, is how do we deal with the connection and contribution and how we talk about this internally, as much as I think people usually assume that brand faces externally.
I love that question so much, because I think often people come to us through the lens of telling external stories to their various stakeholders. And the biggest stakeholder they often forget is their internal team. And that's actually often where the most power from the work that we do comes from. Because if we can weave a narrative in an authentic way that connects all of these different parts of what makes an effective strategy, what makes an effective organization, in a way that the team can really distill a clarity of purpose for their work and see how they fit in to making that vision or that purpose realized, that's when things can kind of unfold organically, where you don't need to check the 500-page deck on your Google Drive to see if you're hitting your marks or not. Yeah. And I think it really, it reminds me of a couple other important elements that we think about with strategy that I'd be curious to riff on a little bit with you here. And the two elements would be niche, or in the business world would be referred to as kind of positioning, or maybe even approach to doing the work. And so that's one that I think we could really start with. And the other is, I'd love to unpack a little bit how values and strategy work kind of synergistically, because the way that I really like to think about values in any given organization is, this is how we do things here, not so much these different words. And, you know, we have values on our site. I think it's worth doing that exercise, but the values need to actually be kind of a code of conduct or an ethics system around how things are done at an organization, not necessarily just words that sound good. So I'd be curious to hear your perspective on both of those elements and how they weave into strategy.
So I think to your point about like niche position, et cetera, the way that we always sit down and look at it, because we rarely are working. So like one of the, like, let's start with assumptions, right? When you come into an organization academically, it's great to talk about all of this. And usually the tenor of the conversation assumes either implicitly or explicitly that we have the benefit of a blank slate. In most cases, you don't. You are coming into a business or an organization that exists, that has team members in place, that is executing on programs, that is otherwise functioning, however well, doesn't matter, but something exists, right? So you are coming into something. And if they are functioning vaguely well, they must be delivering value effectively or well enough to somebody to continue to exist. So you always have that assumption. And one of the big things that we want to look at as we look at the core is not only is where you get the two-sided coin comes in, right? People will ask and say, well, it's great that you're engaging, my customers or the beneficiaries of my work in this process. Like, are they just leading me around by the nose and I'm just going to do whatever they ask for? The answer to that is no. What you want to understand from them is what value do they need from you, and really understand the layers that go into that value, because value is always multidimensional. Once you understand that, you as a team can bring your amazing brain power and say, okay, what are the actions that we are going to take, which is one of the questions answered in your core, as a business to deliver that most effectively. And one of the things that we push on when we're working with clients is, what are you uniquely positioned to do? Right? Like, what is that lattice work of actions that you do better than anyone else, more distinctly than anyone else, and that combination really puts you in a unique as possible, because I don't actually believe there are total snowflakes out there, but that puts you in a really good position to serve your specific person or community really effectively as possible. And really trying to push on that specificity has a tendency to be a lessening exercise, not an additive process, right? Like, what can we get rid of? Because we don't really need to do this, and just because everybody else is doesn't mean we need to too, and understanding how they go together. To be more specific about your question about like positioning, I think there is absolutely brand value to understanding that, because you need to know what space you're then going to go have to shout your message into. And my hat is off to the people that try to navigate that. But there is strategic value. And the way I like to think about it is, how do you see yourself when you look in the mirror? And this is not something that we always document. We do for some clients when it was really valuable. We don't for others. If it was like, yeah, that didn't really tell us anything that added a lot to this conversation or isn't captured elsewhere. But I think about Mattel, who recently has been coming out with films like the Barbie movie and all of that, and saying, we're not a toy company, we're an IP company. And understanding how you see yourself does provide, I think, a really important framing in a lot of cases that goes, oh, like, if we think about ourselves that way, I may make different choices about what actions, very specifically, what actions we choose to put into our core versus not. So it's a really interesting question, and has really pretty substantive overlap, I think, with brand as far as your identity, because there's, people think of identity and they're like, your logo. And I'm like, yes. And, like so many other things that actually go into your identity. I don't know if you have any, thoughts on that, or how you think about positioning and what you're usually helping them to work through. But I would be curious as to sort of how does that hit you? And then I promise I won't forget your question about values.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of overlap in how we think about this. And I think you brought up this idea of like, what is it that you do differently or better than anyone else? And I think that's often a really good place to start. The origin story of the organization is often a good place to look for clues. It might not be the final story, but to see like what was the kind of impetus for starting the organization in the first place? Because I think what often happens is there's some organic, natural way that gets started, or some spark that creates an organization. And then as the organization grows over time, especially in the nonprofit space and the social impact sector, where you start to see how your given cause or issue area relates to the larger systemic issues at play, you start to see how all these other problems are creating problems for your issue. And there's a natural tendency to want to fix that too. Or
Yeah.
other times you get a grant, and the grant is very restricted and focused on one program area, or maybe even means you have to spin up a new program that's like tangentially related to what you do, but not really supportive of that kind of core initial purpose of the organization. And so you start to get this kind of constellation of programs and priorities, and it's like this mission creep that can kind of happen over time. And I think what we help our clients do a lot of times is really look at the space that they're playing in, or the category or the focus area of their organization, and say, who else is playing in this space? And they're not necessarily competitors. You could argue that maybe they are competing for dollars or grants. And so in certain ways they are, but they're really more your partners, because at the end of the day, in the social impact space, we're trying to solve intractable problems. We're not trying to be, grow business for the sake of growing business like you would in the corporate world. So if you look at it from that perspective, like, what are your unique strengths as an organization? What can you bring to the table for the issue, not just for your donors or for your organization or for whoever's, writing you grants, but to actually make like meaningful impact on the issue area? Where are you most valuable? And can you put more focus there and partner with other organizations who are maybe even better over here? I think the other thing that is important to consider as part of positioning is, what is often referred to as kind of point of view, which is kind of how you think about the work, or your perspectives on how the work should be happening, or your approach. It can kind of tie into the theory of change if you go through an exercise like that as a nonprofit, but it doesn't need to be. It just needs to be, how do you think about this work? So for example, our point of view when we think about doing digital work in the social impact sector is that you need to think and act like a digital media company and not a charity. That's a way of thinking about our work that influences every decision we make with a client. There's other agencies in the nonprofit space, in the social impact space, other designers. They're all going to have their own different point of view around how the work should be done. So I think that's an interesting element to consider when it relates to positioning, which then kind of informs strategy.
It does. And it especially, we often think about that under the larger umbrella of storytelling. But as we were talking about earlier, like, the line between where strategy ends and where story begins is very, very gray. Like, there's a reason why The Art of War is written mostly like in parable and story. Like, it's a very powerful piece of what's going on there. And I think a lot of handshaking needs to go on to make sure that all makes really good sense. And, the right people with the right skills and perspectives are sitting at the table to have those conversations. But spot on. And I'm sort of interested, and then I'll answer your original question about your thoughts about, you touched on something that I always think is like a really good, and I don't want to say obvious, but like, yes, we should do that approach, which is to say, this is a thing that needs to be done, but it is not a thing for me to do. It is a thing for that organization to do, or that organization already does it. Let's partner with them. And I'm curious, what your thoughts are about partnerships, particularly from a brand point of view, because I think I just feel like there's a lot of layers to potentially unpack there as to how that works and what that means for how you communicate, not only to help people take advantage of whatever it is your partner does, but how you talk about that to other people. And then, of course, if you've seen any challenges with, and I'll share the challenge that I've seen, the fact that challenges in being able to pursue that. And one of the challenges I see is baked into the infrastructure of how a lot of nonprofits get funded, which is, if you're seeking grant fund money, most of them is tied to new programs. So if you're not launching a new program, you don't get the checky, which is why I think a lot of nonprofits end up launching tangential programs, because they're looking for money. And I'm just curious if you've ever had some of those conversations, or, been in that position of having to figure out how to brand varying points that maybe shouldn't all be in one place, but you sort of don't have a choice, and sort of what that experience has been like for you, as well as just general thoughts on partnership from a brand point of view. Is it an opportunity? Is it a hindrance? Is it confusing? All of the above.
Yeah. I mean, to speak to the first question around partnerships, I think generally we're a big fan of partnerships if there is a potential for a mutually beneficial outcome of that work. And where we see that is in these situations where there's multiple organizations working on an issue area, but in different ways. So like one example might be like a think tank versus a boots on the ground nonprofit, where like the think tank is funded to have big ideas and think about them and look at trends and look at patterns, but they're not actually doing boots on the ground work. So they need the organizations who are actually working tangibly on these issue areas with the people that are affected by them to understand things from a less theoretical and more of a lived experience level. If you have only think tanks, but no organizations actually executing or implementing, then it's just an exercise in thought, right? And so you need both. So that's one example. With regards to multiple programs being spun up and fighting for dollars and grants kind of mostly prioritizing new programs being spun up, there's definitely an issue there. And I think it's an issue that's been, at this point, pretty well identified in the nonprofit sector and has led to what's hopefully a positive new trajectory or movement around trust-based philanthropy, where there are less restricted grants or more general operating grants being written for organizations who have either a proven track record or a good relationship with a funder, so that the funder really places more trust in the organization doing the work to guide prioritization of funds, whether or not a new program should be spun up. And I think there's a very healthy push-pull there. Like, I think there is potential and certainly examples of extreme waste in the nonprofit sector where a lot of money has gone into an organization or a number of organizations, and the impact of that work has been lackluster for various reasons, right? And then there's examples where I would say more commonly there's really good intentions, there's really good strategy, and there's just a lack of capacity. These organizations are under-resourced. They're not able to pay market rate for their employees. They're not able to invest in overhead and infrastructure because of these narratives around overhead being bad. Yeah. And so I would say that there's a need for this sector to evolve and to become more sustainable with a capital S in a way that actually creates impact, because at the end of the day, those are the metrics that we need to be looking at when we're doing this work. Does it actually improve people's lives? Does it actually move humanity forward? And some of these problems will never be fully solved. They may end up being problems we just chip away at over time and make improvements over time. But other problems can be solved. And sometimes it is literally just a lack of money. Other times it's a lack of clarity around the best approach, or they're more intractable issues. So I think there's some good trends there. And I think where strategy really comes into play with all of this is that if you have a clear strategy, a clear point of view as an organization, an effective way of telling that impact story in an emotionally driven way that's also clear at the same time, then you have more opportunities as an organization to say, yes, this is a good fit for us. No, this grant isn't a good fit for us. Or to even educate funders or donors around where the priorities stand and how you can take those resources and most effectively apply them to your issue area. So I think it's all related, and that's why this conversation has been so interesting, is because there is a need for strategy. There is a need for that to inform story, but story informs strategy. So it's this kind of circular living thing. And it's really just fascinating to hear your perspectives around how you see it from your side of the work versus how we see it from our side. Okay, so let's get back to values. So I kind of framed this up originally as, how do we think about values? How do values inform strategy? How are they rolled into strategy? If you think about values as just these words that you agree upon as being kind of guiding words, that can be kind of helpful. But I think really values should guide the work. It should really define and explain how you think about things and how you do things day to day in an organization. But I'd be really curious to hear how values fit into your work and how you think about strategy.
We have a very similar point of view on this one. What you typically see is people being like, our values, you'll go to their website and you'll get like 6 words. And I can predict what half of them will be, because most people come up with some of the same ones, like collaboration, one of my favorites. Everybody wants to be collaborative. So collaboration is on, everybody's website. And that's about all you get. Sometimes you get like longer sort of belief-based statements. These are things we believe in. And, we actually don't spend a phenomenal amount of time on what people believe, because that can get you into some very murky waters around the fact that you may have team members who believe different things, and how do we deal with some of those moral and inclusive challenges. However, as a business, you all have to work together. So understanding how do we do things here on this team specifically is a key component of your strategy. In fact, we put it into your core as a business. It's one of the questions that you must answer. How do we take the actions that we take as a business? And when we work to develop them, one, we don't have them developed by leadership. We typically facilitate the rest of the staff actually putting these together, and understanding, what does work, what doesn't work, both from how we work together as a team, as well as how does this advance our ability to fulfill our purpose as an organization. And then they're always written. We would never ever suggest turning in a one-word value. We want you to help me, show me what it's going to look like to practice that value. And this is because we think of values as a filter for human behavior, right? Like, this is how we're going to do things. Show me what that's going to look like here. So we're big fans of values. Like, there's one at my company that says we put in an extra 15 minutes. Like, instead of saying we're trying to do really great work because isn't everybody, the way that it's actually practiced here at our business that is really key to how we understand our work, how we think about our work, how we do our work, is that we put in that extra 15 minutes. And then underneath, there's a description of what that actually looks like. And we usually advise, and I try to do them myself for my own company, values with bumper guards, right? Like, you can take any practice too far, and actually end up with potentially unintended consequences, or practices that you aren't looking for. So trying to really make sure that you understand, like, for us, the bumper guard is perfect isn't real. Like, yes, we want you to put in that extra bit of time to be sure that every dot is tied, every T crossed off, that it is the best that you can do, but realize perfect isn't real, and at the end of the day, our clients need what they need from us, and we need to move forward, and we can learn and improve throughout the process. So thinking about that, and really thinking about how you write them and how you share them is a big piece of values. But to me, you have such an ability today to be specific in not just, hey, as a business, we offer these 3 service tracks, but here's how we offer the service. Here's how we communicate. Here's the language that we choose to use. Like, you have so much opportunity to design your business to be specific, that you should take advantage of that and really see it as not just a nice culture building activity. It affects culture 100%. But really a part of this is strategically going to allow us to more effectively deliver value, to more effectively work together as a team, and defines us as different. It's part of that lattice work and the combination of our actions from other organizations and businesses.
Awesome. Yeah. And I really especially love having a portrayal of what that value looks like in action. I think that's so helpful to get specific, because oftentimes values are these, especially if they're just written down as a word, it's up for interpretation, and people might, interpret that word differently to mean something different in terms of how it shows up in actual work, or it can just be very vague. Like, what does empathy look like in our work, for example? And so we've done a pretty good job, I think, doing that here at Cosmic, but even having this conversation is getting my gears turning around. Like, how can we even take that to the next level with some specific examples, beyond just conversations that we have every day? So Katie, I've really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks so much for joining today. How can people get in touch and follow you and keep up with the work you're doing?
The best way to get a hold of me is to find me on LinkedIn. You can always, connect with me. I accept connections from everyone. I have unconnected with only a handful of very bad salespeople. And if you want to have a coffee with me, drop me a message and we'll set one up. I'd love to meet you. The other best way to stay in contact with me and some of what I'm thinking about, what's going on, is to subscribe to my Substack, which is called WTP, which stands for What's the Point? And you can find it at wtpfocus.substack.com. Thanks
so much for joining today, Katie.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks again for joining us today. I'm Eric Ressler, founder and creative director at Cosmic, the creative agency for modern social impact organizations. If you're interested in more conversations and insights like this, please visit our website at designbycosmic.com, where we publish regular insights on the strategies, mindsets, and behaviors modern social impact leaders use to play and win in the attention economy. Please also consider following me on LinkedIn, shoot me a DM, and I'd love to connect.